I'd like tonight to thank the sponsors, the TRIM group in this area, because as I go across the country, I'm very much indebted to those who stand for less government through less taxes and less taxes through less government. And I'd also like to thank each and every one of you, because I know that there are many things competing for your time, particularly on a weekend, for your interest. The topic tonight is going to be Washington, D.C., the economy, and particularly the subject of curing the recession. With regard to Washington, D.C., it's an exciting place, and it's also becoming a very dangerous time. It's an exciting place because I think that we who are there in the Congress have an opportunity, perhaps as never before, to take positive steps that will be of lasting value, not only for our time, but for generations unborn. And it's exciting to be at that spot in history at this particular time. It's somewhat dangerous because I think that the possibility of failure in that endeavor is sliding, I'm sorry to say, towards a probability of failure. And that type of statement, I think, requires a little bit of background of history to set the stage for the situation we find ourselves in tonight. And that bit of background goes to the fact that we are perhaps entering, as a nation, into our third transitional period. Now, our first transition took place when we had that severance of relations with England. And in that, we used the term American Revolution. Technically, it was not a revolution, it was a rebellion. It was a separation. But there was not an overturning of values, of the monetary concepts, the social values, moral values, spiritual values. There was a severance with the crown because we said that we felt the taxes were too high and there were too many controls by the king and the king's agents. And because of this, our founding fathers were willing to break away in a move for independence. And after that successful contest of arms, we had that first transition from the initial government under the Articles of Confederation to our second form of government under a constitutional republic, where our founding fathers felt that the concept of government in our society would be based upon the law, right and wrong, would be based upon the law rather than the judgment decisions of men. And Thomas Jefferson, in referring to the republic, had this quotation, and it's interesting because it refers to their time in the first sentence. And in the remaining sentences, it refers to future times, particularly to our time. When Thomas Jefferson said, yes, we did produce a near perfect republic, but will they keep it? Or will they? He said, will they, in the enjoyment of plenty, lose the memory of freedom? Material abundance without character is the surest way to destruction. Now, the second pillar that our founding fathers gave us was that of a form of prosperity, which we know as the free enterprise system. It merely meant that the government was to stay off your back and out of your pockets, stay out of the farms, out of the manufacturing areas, the distribution areas, the marketplace, the schools, the communities, and so forth. And lastly, as a moral code, acting as the glue for our society and as a foundation of our legal structure, our founding fathers recognized a Christian or biblical heritage or basis of morality. Philosophically speaking, our founding fathers felt that the function of the central government, the federal government, was to protect life and property, particularly from criminals or foreign invaders. But they were very strong that the function of the federal government was not to be a provider of goods and services, because they knew full well that once a government set itself up as the function of being a provider of goods and services, that it is inevitable that two things would take place. First, you would produce a conflict society. Secondly, as night follows the day, you would go bankrupt. The first part is that once people led to believe, if I don't have what I feel that I need, the government should provide it for me, they knew that the farmers would organize and stop viewing themselves as Americans, but as part of a special interest group, a minority, that must now organize and threaten to strike and demonstrate to get theirs. Teachers would organize and use their political clout to get people in high office to guarantee theirs. And big labor would nuzzle up to the trough to get theirs. And big business would not be immune, and they would try to manipulate the laws to guarantee theirs and so forth. That we would divide ourselves into warring factions, each competing with the other to get to the trough ahead of the competition. Second thing that would take place, that the demands would always exceed the ability of the Treasury to provide, with the result that that society would go bankrupt, be dissolved over a loose fiscal policy, causing a dissolution of the social order, the political system, into rioting and violence, always, history is quite clear, replaced by ultimately a dictatorship, and you lose your liberties. So our founding fathers avoided that, and for 150 years we operated under the principles of limited government in a constitutional republic. And that was the first transition from the Articles of Confederation to a constitutional republic, and by and large we kept that coming into the 20th century. Now the roots of the second transition, a major taproot, goes back to the year of 1913, in the early part of the Woodrow Wilson administration. 1913, we had the 16th Amendment, the federal taxation on personal income. But we were told you don't need to worry about that. While yes, the power to tax is the power to destroy, don't worry. We're never going to have that tax above a 2%. That would be the absolute top bracket. Maybe in a total emergency, we'd get a little over 2%, but it would be kept down to about 1%. Don't worry about it. It'll be all right. And the 17th Amendment, which was a direct blow at the concept of the republic and a union of sovereign states coming together under a federal umbrella. That directional election of senators, that transition that took place with the 17th Amendment, was a great blow to that concept. But by law, not amendment, the creation of a central banking apparatus. The mechanism, the machinery now for the government to spend endlessly without the restraints of a budget, the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Now this was very helpful because as we moved into World War I, so much of that was financed through debt financing and expansion of the money supply. But after the war, there was a beginning of a readjustment period of that monetary disequilibrium that brought on a little recession in 2021. Politicians in Washington panicked. There was credit expansion, continued monetary expansion through the Federal Reserve through the 20s. But in 1928, the Federal Reserve slammed on the monetary brakes, slammed on the credit expansion, and that hit the stock market and the business community by the fall of 1929. And we had the coming of the Great Depression. Now, to many Republicans, it's quite a shock to learn that the true father of the New Deal was not FDR, but was frankly Herbert Hoover. In fact, he even bragged about the fact that he was the originator of so many of the programs that became fully entrenched in the New Deal. And it might be accurately said that he was the real father of the New Deal. And as we moved into the Depression in 1929, and 1930, 1931, a lot of people think the reason we were in the mess because Hoover did nothing. He stood beside. History is quite clear. He embarked upon tremendous interventionist policies that prevented the monetary readjustment from rapidly taking place, and the result was that intervention deepened and lengthened the Depression. He did not stand on the sidelines, as is the popular Hoover myth. And with failing businesses, rising unemployment, and rising bankruptcies, and the loss of hope, many Americans were led by news media pundits, by speakers, by members of the academic community to accept the proposition that the American system had failed, that in a modern society we needed modern machinery. And I think very clearly it is evident today that the American system did not fail, but the perversion of the system was what had failed in the 1920s and early 30s. With this, FDR was elected to come to the rescue, and we officially embarked upon the program known as the New Deal. And tonight I would submit without equivocation that we have been on the New Deal policies for 50 years. During both Democrat and Republican administrations, the expansion of government. And during this time, we've seen the tremendous expansion of the news media and the ability of the news media to step in not as an objective reporter of the news, but as now a manufacturer, as an editorial capability in the news, to cause people to look upon their leaders in a very glowing fashion or with contempt and rejection. Let me give you a major figure, some of the statements of a major figure of the last 50 years of my lifetime, some of the major statements that this person has made in this public life. The Constitution of the United States gives Congress no power to legislate in the matters of a great number of vital problems of government, such as the conduct of public utilities, of banks, of insurance, of business, of agriculture, of education, of social welfare, and of a dozen other important features. Washington must never be permitted to interfere in these avenues of our affairs. Our nation has been a successful experiment in democratic government because the individual states have waived in only a few instances their sovereign rights. But there is a tendency, and to my mind a dangerous tendency, on the part of our national government to encroach, on one excuse or another, more and more upon state supremacy. The elastic theory of the interstate commerce, for instance, has been stretched almost to the breaking point to cover certain regulatory powers desired by Washington. For 3 long years, I've been going up and down this country preaching that government, federal, state, and local, costs too much. I shall not stop preaching. As an immediate program of action, we must abolish useless offices. We must eliminate unnecessary functions of government, functions, in fact, that are not definitely essential to the continuance of government. We must merge, we must consolidate subdivisions of government, and like the private citizen, give up luxuries which we can no longer afford. I regard reduction in federal spending as one of the most important issues of this campaign. If a nation is living within its income, its credit is good. But if, like a spendthrift, it throws discretion to the winds and is willing to make no sacrifice at all in spending, if it extends its taxing powers to the limit of the people's power to pay and continues to pile up deficits, then it is on the road to bankruptcy. Taxes are paid in the sweat of every man who labors because they are a burden on production and are paid through production. If those taxes are excessive, they are reflected in idle factories, in tax-sold farms, and in hordes of hungry people tramping the streets, seeking jobs in vain, and so forth. Who was the individual? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Those are all statements made by FDR prior to his election. Now, after the election, he became rapidly surrounded by a group of people that were slavish in their devotion to him and in their adulation. He was a man who craved adulation and soaked it up like a sponge. People who were not willing to fall all over themselves in giving adulation wound up sort of being shunted aside. But at any rate, he became surrounded by those who were sometimes Marxists in their views, outright Marxists, certainly many utopian and one-worlders. And we were told in the debates on the House and Senate floor in the 1930s that if we adopt these programs of the New Deal, we'll be able to eliminate all poverty, all ignorance. We'll be able to eliminate the strife in our society and enter into a utopian period of prosperity undreamed of. We just adopt these programs. And ladies and gentlemen, we adopted them. We have been on that treadmill clearly for 50 years. But the best summation was not expressed by some of the political statements on the House and Senate floor. The best summation was expressed by a slavish devotee of FDR, one of his close inner circle advisors, and in a moment of pure candor, first at a racetrack, I believe in Maryland, and then later at a press conference, he summarized, yes, that's the philosophy of the New Deal, that expressed by Harry Hopkins. We said the real philosophy is to tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect, because the people are too damn dumb to understand. And from my perspective, 8 years as a representative in the Congress, I think you can read every volume in every library in the land, and you cannot find a better summation of the last 50 years of policy in Washington than that expressed by Harry Hopkins. You folks out there work hard. We're going to keep the tax money coming in by every increasing avenue. And then we're going to keep doling it out to one special interest group after another as they get organized and squeal and cry and grunt. And then they're going to keep giving us their votes to keep our crowd in power, because the people are just too dumb to catch on how the game is played. I think it's a pretty good summation. Did it give us the utopia that was promised? Well, the 50-year legacy is this. In 1980, we were approaching an official national debt, the unofficial is much worse, of $1 trillion, the greatest debt in the history of the world, greater than all the other nations of the world combined. The interest on the debt is now approaching a rate of about $4,000 per second, 24 hours a day. When I was in pre-medical training at Davidson College, we had a lot of people running around and saying, "You don't need to worry about interest, because after all, we owe it to ourselves. We don't have to worry about debt. We owe it to ourselves." But of course, now the third largest item in the budget is just paying the interest, and that is a very sick cliche, a stupid cliche that you do not hear much anymore. Taxes have moved up when you figure state, federal, local taxes, all form of federal taxation, of government taxation, state, federal, and local, at about a 50% rate. We have developed the welfare state with the growing concentration of power to Washington. We are now subsidizing collectivism at home and abroad. Through inflation, we have robbed our people to the tune that the dollar today is worth less than a 1932 nickel. The rest has been destroyed, thievery by the political process. Interest rates in 1980 had moved up to 20%, with resulting unemployment, and in foreign policy we are dominated, and have been for openly 40 years, by an international elitist policy guided by such groups as the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. We've seen a loss of our republic, a loss of a government of law, and an acceptance of a government of men, a government by bureau, a government by regulation, commissions, and so forth. The free enterprise system today is merely an anemic shadow of its former meaning. And our traditional values of Christian or biblical morality have been replaced openly by concepts, principles of humanism. This has been the second transition, beginning 50 years ago, moving away from a republic, constitutional republic, into the welfare state. We've been in that for 50 years. 1980, gropingly and with difficulty, the American people went to the polls in November. And there's a lot of disagreement among the people as to what we should do and how we got into this mess. But one thing people understood: more government, more spending is not going to solve the problem created by a government already too big. That point was clear. And it was clearly expressed in the elections of the Senate, when you had one leader after another of America's leftward surge on a bipartisan basis go down to defeat. Had a wag in my district after November of 1980 said, you know, he observed that if you want to get the mud out of the creek, you got to get the hogs out of the spring. Very fundamental. And I tell you, in November of 1980, we really got the hogs out of the spring. McGovern went down to defeat. Church went down to defeat. Culver went down to defeat. Gravel went down to defeat. Javits went down to defeat. Morgan went down to defeat, and so forth. In each and every instance, the welfare staters, the internationalist-oriented crowd, were replaced by those who were closer to traditional values. In the White House, President Carter became a one-termer, as there was a landslide for Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had expressed himself as an open foe of the New Deal, of the Great Society, and in his speeches referred to the fallacy of tax and tax, spend and spend, over and over in his speeches. I don't know whether he knew it or not, but he was quoting Harry Hopkins' statement of the 1930s. And Mr. Reagan, after years in the political wilderness, had gained the nomination and the election to the presidency on the promises to cut the size and cost of government, to balance the budget, to cut taxes, beef up our defense, stop the retreat in foreign policy, and in many lesser promises. A promise to defund the left in this country, to cut out the funding for the over 10,000 radical leftist groups that are receiving taxpayers' money, to not allow a betrayal of Taiwan. And it was clearly a conservative victory in 1980 over the pollsters, the media, and the establishment that has gripped this country by the throat. The rhetoric of Mr. Reagan was clearly outstanding. But then I remember the rhetoric of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in 1980, there were some disturbing signs. In a speech in September of 1980, Mr. Reagan stated, as a candidate, that he really would not try to move to balance the budget until fiscal year 1983. That is very bothersome because it means you're going to give 2 years, spot 2 years to the enemy, which means mounting deficits during those 2 years, added to the already malignant national debt level, which means even greater payments on the interest of the debt, which means a greater burden on our taxpayers, which is going to require even more draconian measures to bring ultimately a balanced budget. Also, there's another reason, and that is because the American taxpayers, the American people, when a new president comes in, particularly saying, I oppose the policies clearly of the past, they give him a honeymoon period. Roosevelt had his 100 days. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has written about the 100 days and so forth. We all admit, we give you time to get your program, your act together, to let us know where you're going. We're not going to bother you during that period. But the president said no. He's going to wait till 1983. And then a surprising move to the Reagan supporters, he chose George Bush, and a nationalist elitist member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, as his running mate. And that bothered people. But we didn't have to be too upset because we did have the California Kitchen Cabinet, Justin Dart, Holmes Tuttle, Joe Coors of Colorado, and others very close to the president that were going to keep him at his grassroots fundamentals. That's what we were assured. But then in the transition period after Mr. Carter was defeated and prior to Mr. Reagan becoming president, during that transition where they're setting up the machinery for change, the conservative Republicans in Washington were astounded that key slot after key slot was going to the Bush group, the old Rockefeller wing of the party, and the Reagan crowd was out in the cold. And then we saw the cabinet, and it read like a who's who of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. And early on, we saw Mr. James Baker selected as the Chief of Staff for the White House. Now, Mr. Baker had been the campaign manager for the opposition of Reagan in 1976 and in 1980. He had been George Bush's campaign manager. He's clearly of the elitist wing of the Republican Party from the state of Texas. He's sort of an Elliot Richardson, Texas style. And you're choosing as your running mate your perhaps bitterest enemy on the stump, the man who had ridiculed the cornerstone of your policy, your economic policy, as voodoo economics. That man you bring in as your running mate. His campaign manager you bring in to run the White House. You say, well, that doesn't amount to much. It amounts to who gets to see the president and who does not. It amounts to what reading material will go on his desk, which scenarios will be presented as options to take. That was under control of Baker. And then Mr. Deaver, who had been a long time in the Reagan entourage, he'd been cutting grass over the past years. He had been a bartender for the Reagans on various occasions. Mr. Deaver was brought in as a man under Baker. Mr. Deaver is a man of no philosophical beliefs. He's going to do whatever it takes to promote and stay in the line. And so he is now under Baker, clearly under the Baker sway. Ed Meese, though, was brought in. A lot of people felt, well, Ed Meese has been a long-time associate, and he will keep things straight. Unfortunately, Mr. Ed Meese's desk is piled up even as large as my desk is piled up. It's turned out not to be well organized and is unable to cope with the massive number of decisions and the awesome array of decisions there in Washington. And he's thoroughly outgunned and outorganized by Mr. Baker, who is incredibly well organized and knows exactly what he wants to do and has a long-range perspective and plan to get there. So Ed Meese is being clearly outgunned. Len Knopfsinger was there in the White House, however, and he's long-standing conservative credentials, and after a while he simply quit and went back to California. In short, we are heading for a disaster if there is no reversal of the policy of tax and tax and spend and spend. Now we ask ourselves today, in 1982, how can this be? Now, let me say that there in Washington, we clearly knew, you really had to not have two brain cells rubbing together in 1980 not to know that this was not business as usual. We clearly had tremendous problems in the economy. We knew this. Let me give you an example. In 1980, twice in the fall, once in September and once in October, I happened to be in the company of a group of Democrats, and the man who was speaking was Congressman Charles Vanek of Ohio. He had a long career, about 30 years in the House. He was retiring in 1980. He had been the #2 man on the Taxation Committee, the Ways and Means Committee. Now, Charles Vanek was a strong follower of the New Deal Great Society programs, no question about it. But, and we disagreed on virtually every program. But Charlie Vanek was discussing on these two occasions the fact that the dumbest thing we can do as Democrats is work to re-elect Jimmy Carter. He said, we ought to let Ronald Reagan have the presidency. And many people in Washington were confused as what the outcome was going to be in November. By no means was it clear there. It might have been very clear in the grassroots America, but everybody in Washington was confused, I can tell you that. But the prescription that Charlie Vanek said was, we should let the Republicans have the White House. Let Mr. Reagan get in there, because I tell you, he said it's a hopeless trap. Interest rates are going to go to over 25%. Inflation rate will go ultimately to over 25%. There's going to be a tremendous increase of unemployment and problems of this type. And he said that it's a trap. There is no way out. Let Mr. Reagan and the Republicans have it. The roof will fall in, and we will not have to worry about them again for 50 years. That was his assessment. Now, of interest, early part of this year, January, February, I saw former Congressman Vanek in the halls of the Cannon office building. And I said, hi, Charlie. Hi, Larry. How you doing? And I said, Charlie, you know, in some of my talks, I've been using some of your remarks. And I was amazed because we didn't have that much going between us. And I was really amazed because he read my mind. And he said, yes. He said, it's a shame. It is a trap. The president really didn't cause this disaster, but he's going to get the blame. The roof is now falling in. The situation and the requirements for early 1981 were those that required an aggressive challenge to the New Deal Great Society programs of tax and tax. We had to meet it head on. It required confrontation politics. The president had to be a fighter, and he must dare to be controversial. He must be bold and decisive. Mr. Reagan, excellent words in his speeches, but the reality of his actions has been other than his words. Mr. Reagan is guided as a personality trait by a strategic triad of politics. Number one, he believes in consensus politics. Number two, he believes in non-confrontation. Number three, he believes in gradualism. Now, in normal times, in times that does not require bold and decisive leadership, does not require willing to take on the enemy, and where it would basically be required of a president to clean up his inbox every morning on the desk and to make good judgment decisions, I think Mr. Reagan could go down as a great American president. But we clearly are not living in normal times. Mr. Reagan believes, as president, that we should have a policy of gradualism. He's expressed this. He said the ship of state is like a giant ocean liner, and you do not change the direction of an ocean liner dramatically, lest it create, in his terms, massive disruptions. If you've got a situation, you turn it very dramatically in a sharp turn, and the ship, you know, that cocktail glasses would slide off the table, the piano might slide 5 or 6 feet, and it creates disruptions. But if you're on the Titanic and you're heading towards an iceberg, your choice is massive disruptions or sinking. Because, as I say, we're not in a routine thing. The examples of gradualism are as follows. In 1981, the big initial contest was on the Graham-Latta bill, the budget cut. You may recall that. The media was moaning and groaning about the fact that sick people are going to be lying out in the street, dying. What a terrible thing this would be. And we must not have these horrible budget cuts. But you know, the budget went up, not down, with the passage of the bill. We did not really cut the budget. What we did, we reduced the increase in the budget. It simply did not go up as much as it would have gone up had Carter been president. The second major cornerstone of 1981 was the passage of the tax cut bill, the Hance-Conable bill, or Conable-Hance. And in reality, we really did not cut taxes. Now, that bill was viewed as the greatest single tax cut in history, but when you figure all areas of taxation, increase in Social Security tax and bracket creep due to inflation, taxes for the average, on the average for the American taxpayer, went up, not down. They simply did not go up as much as otherwise would have been the case under the Carter plan. So it was a gradual approach to the problem. We did not dramatically actually reduce the overall tax burden to the American people. The only way for this 4-year period to carry out the speeches of Ronald Reagan was to have boldness in leadership, to be willing to tackle bad news, to have confrontation, be willing to fight the Congress, and if necessary, to then take the fight to the American public, and to move quickly, because time was running out. Now, the New Deal was a success as the result of the 1934 elections, not 1932. Roosevelt was elected in 32 and clearly put into power the expansion of the New Deal. But in 1934, unemployment was up. A lot of people forget that. Unemployment was greater in 1934 than it was in 1932. But Roosevelt was a master of a campaigner, and he did two things, two very smart things. One thing was, he gave the American people hope. Statement, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he gave them hope that, don't worry folks, hang on, a better day is coming tomorrow. The second thing that he did, as a master campaigner, he created an enemy. The robber barons, the greedy of this country, they're the ones that have created the problem. He created an enemy out there. It wasn't very honest, but it's all right. It's very successful. Now, Mr. Reagan on television has every capability of salesmanship equal to FDR on radio, and I think surpasses FDR in area of communication. He is a master of a presenter on television. And he has the capability to give the American people hope, and I think he has been doing this. People have said, yes, I'm maybe out of a job, but I trust the president, I think his programs will work, and I'm sticking with him, that type of thing. Polls have shown that, been very slow to move away. But President Reagan has not created an enemy. And the enemy, of course, is very clearly the big spending Congress. Now, why was it necessary to move quickly? Why was it necessary to have confrontation and to move with boldness? Because if you're going to reverse the New Deal Great Society, you're up against the giant establishment of the majority of the Congress, who are followers of the New Deal, of the vast bureaucracy. And in Washington, we're referring to the bureaucracy. You're referring to those unelected people in that giant part of the executive branch of government. People who say, I'm going to be here after this crowd is gone. Politicians come and politicians go, but the bureaucracy remains. They don't get upset by someone coming up saying we're going to change things, because they know that they can slow them down, entangle them with regulations, wear them out, and finally they will go. And then the bureaucracy will remain. You have the elitist groups, you have the news media, the labor unions, over 7,000 Washington lobbyists, the tax-exempt foundations, organized left groups, and the academic community, just to name a few. All of these are dominated by followers of the New Deal and Great Society. If you just think you're going to turn this around by saying, folks, let's just change the policies, they will just laugh themselves to sleep. In the area of Washington lobbyists, some of you say, well, that's not all bad, because there are a lot of lobbyists up there for free enterprise businesses. Well, there are a few noble exceptions. But if you think the lobbyists for, quote, big business are up there promoting free enterprise, you're very naive. They're up there promoting a special government benefit for their business and restrictions for the competition. Most of them. The joke is in Washington, it's a good thing most of the lobbyists are men, because if they were women, they'd be pregnant 100% of the time. Because they're perfectly willing to do whatever it takes to get the benefits, to get the legislative thing manipulated around to suit their particular enterprise. The result to date of consensus non-confrontation of gradualism, well, let's take a look at a few areas. American Enterprise Institute says that the Ronald Reagan proposed budgets for his 4 years will result to a budget deficit of $875 billion. Almost $1 trillion for 4 years. Now, maybe you don't like that figure. Maybe you'd like to take the president's statement, which he gave on May the 14th when he predicted budget deficits of $631 billion of his proposed plans. Why is Reagan going this route? Well, one possibility is that the man was actually never a conservative. And he is willing to help destroy the conservative movement, and particularly destroy the conservative Republicans, by simply leading them over a cliff. It's one possibility. Another possibility is that the man really has no clear beliefs. But he has come to realize that the power is in the hands of the establishment, and if you want to get ahead, you got to play ball and be subservient to that power. And he's now said, I'll do what you want. Now, a third possibility is that the man means well, that he is an American with basically very good instincts, but he has been captured by the elite wing of the Republican Party and the internationalist establishment as a general rule. He's now a captive in the White House, shielded from reality by his enemies, a takeover of Bush, Baker, and Deaver, and the liberal element of the cabinet. It's a very real possibility. Many people in Washington feel this. But if you like the contemporary good news and bad news, the good news tonight is, it's a recent development, just in the last few days, the president has decided to move into the policy of confrontation politics for the first time. Clearly that is the case. He's now on the war path, and he's moving towards the confrontation. That's the good news. The bad news is the confrontation is to be against the conservatives in the Congress. Last month, the enemy was Brezhnev and Tip O'Neill. Now, the enemy is Jack Kemp and the conservatives in the Congress who are holding up the plan for the tax increase, the greatest single tax increase in history. Now, the president says it's not the greatest. In a 3-year period, we had the windfall profits tax that's greater, we had the Social Security tax that's greater, but the plan of Dole is a 5-year plan. And according to Mr. Reagan's own Treasury Department spokesman, they state it is the greatest single tax increase in history. The tax increase bill represents a total victory for the Bush-Baker wing in the White House, and a 180-degree reversal of what President Reagan campaigned on as a candidate. And the support of the now Reagan-Dole thing that passed the Senate. Day after tomorrow, President Reagan is going on nationwide television to push for increased taxes in a recession. I don't know of any time in history somebody's advocated that. It's like having a drowning man out here and throwing him a lead-weighted life buoy. Now, it should bother you a little bit when you look around as who is behind the president. Tip O'Neill has joined with him enthusiastically. The labor unions have joined with the president enthusiastically to push through the tax increase. Mr. O'Neill says, the Speaker of the House, Mr. President, come make a joint declaration, a joint address the House and Senate in a joint session. If the president does this, it will amount to the complete humiliation of Ronald Reagan before the Congress, and almost coming and bowing before the Congress and saying, you were right, I was wrong, it's back to business as usual of tax and tax, spend and spend. And following that humiliation, the Congress will go like dogs after a wounded animal, tearing down every cornerstone of the effort to restore American values. We are tonight faced with the dilemma of we have two Ronald Reagans, and which one is the real Ronald Reagan? The first is the man that we elected as president on the speeches of conservative principles. The second is the man who tonight is pushing to turn the clock back to the discredited policies of the welfare state, New Deal, Great Society. Now, I'd like to give you a view from Washington of an analysis of President Reagan by a veteran political observer in Washington. Many of you know him. But he's an expert. He's the most astute political observer that I know of in Washington. In my 8 years, nobody touches him. This is his analysis of what is taking place. It's not necessarily mine. But his view is that the acceptance of George Bush as vice president was a disaster. Choosing Jim Baker as chief of staff, you have an elitist in the cabinet at the top level of chief of staff of the White House. My friend feels that the President Reagan is by far the most naive man to be president, clearly the most naive man since Warren Harding, in his words. He feels that Mr. Reagan is a man of incredibly good instincts, but that he is now totally captured by the group around him. The kitchen cabinet, the vaunted kitchen cabinet of California and Coors, is now kept out and kept away from any private meetings with the president. And the new game plan concocted by this group in the White House is to take on the conservatives in confrontation politics, particularly the conservative Republicans, and beat them on this issue, and by so doing, gain the acceptance of the establishment and be able to move in the, quote, mainstream of the elitist wing of the Republican Party. And that's the analysis of a key man in Washington whose life it has been for many years doing just exactly that. What you can do about it. Now, if you are a dedicated Republican, if you've been putting money into the party and so forth, I don't think you're very bright. Speaking as a Democrat, if you put any money in the National Democratic Party, all of your money goes for the liberal side. None of it goes to support conservatives. But in my opinion, smart people, if they have money, they put money directly behind key candidates who stand for something, and if they desert those principles, they never give them another cent. That, to me, is a smart way to spend money politically. You should never put money to a party in general because the machinery is usually in the hands of your enemy. Now, I've jokingly said for a number of years that dumb people worry about presidential races. The well-informed people are active in the congressional races because it's the legislative branch that is going to be the route for the counterattack on the long road back to restoring vitality to America. Putting on a bumper sticker with someone's name once every 4 years for 1 or 2 weeks requires almost no insight or dedication. That's why I think it's so popular. Very easy. You don't have to know much. Your level of citizenship or participation can be almost zero to do that. But to be willing to have the personal discipline to work day after day, week after week, in between the elections, so that the issues can be framed for your friends, for the people in your neighborhood and your community, to preset the dials to guarantee what type of people might be elected. That is the true test of citizenship today. And this is why I think that if you're not already active and a member of TRIM, I urge you to join, to put your resources and get active in your local level. because TRIM is active on a nonpartisan basis. It is not out to get anyone, it's not out to elect anyone, but it is out to match the rhetoric back home with the record in Washington. Been my experience is so many people come back home, speak to the Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, the Chamber of Commerce, and they look like great patriotic Americans, then go to Washington and vote for the welfare state and laugh about it, get away with it, because the people back home do not know how to match the rhetoric with the record. We have that opportunity with TRIM, that on issue after issue of unconstitutional big spending bills that simply ask the question, where your representative had a choice of voting for higher taxes and more government or less taxes and lower government, which way did your representative vote? Now, as a final little footnote, if you're not concerned because your ox is not getting gored, and you're going to wait until your ox gets gored, then you will deserve the very worst that may come to you. But ladies and gentlemen, if you're a physician, and the only time you speak out and get concerned is when the issue is socialized medicine, if you're a manufacturer, and your job is threatened due to OSHA, if you're a merchant or distributor and you're concerned about consumer protection, if you're a farmer and you're harassed by EPA, and that's the only time you speak out, then we will be destroyed, because each isolated group will be presented to his neighbors as acting out of a greedy pocketbook interest. Your interest is not liberty. Your interest is whether or not you're going to be forced to drive a Chevrolet or a Ford this year instead of a Buick or Cadillac. And the slick editorial writers in the media will present that image to your neighbors, and we will be clipped off one by one. It's important that we all stand up and speak out when the principles of liberty are violated. As a physician, I would like to close with this observation regarding a national disease that is now developed into an epidemic proportion. It was summarized not too long ago in an editorial in a nationwide newspaper. And the editorial went as follows, quote, "There is a new, and as far as we know, unanswered question to ponder. What mysterious affliction has seized the minds of so many of our best people, leaving them unable to answer the simple questions, leaving them unable to recognize their own traditional values, unable to distinguish between dream and reality? The challenge is before us. The goal to cure this malady is the development of an informed electorate. With that, the battle in the Congress is your target. Let's get busy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.